A man is dying on a cot in a military hospital, and the people standing around his bed are not doctors. They are former prisoners of the camp he used to run. He is talking. He cannot stop talking. And the American officer watching this happen has already decided he will never put his name on whatever gets written down tonight. His name was Franz Zierreis, and for 6 years he was the commandant of Mauthausen, a concentration camp built into a granite quarry in the Austrian hills, a place the SS itself had internally classified as the harshest grade in the entire camp system. Reserved for prisoners, it considered the most dangerous, the most political, the most expendable. This wasn't a camp designed primarily around industrial killing the way some others were. It was designed around exhaustion, around turning labor itself into a weapon, and Zierreis ran that machine personally, walking the quarry grounds, present for the punishments he ordered, not a distant bureaucrat signing forms from an office somewhere far from the killing. Under Zierreis, tens of thousands of people died there. Some were shot, some were gassed, some were worked to death, hauling stone blocks up 186 stone steps carved into the quarry wall. A staircase survivors would later call the Stairs of Death, where guards reportedly bet on how long a man could climb before he collapsed under the weight of the rock strapped to his back, and where some prisoners, driven past the point of endurance, are said to have thrown themselves off the quarry edge rather than climb it again. Zierreis is documented as having personally participated in executions at the camp, not simply ordered them from a distance. This is the man an American patrol was hunting in the final chaotic weeks of the war. By the spring of 1945, with the war collapsing around him, Zierreis did what a lot of men in his position did. He ran. On the 3rd of May, he slipped away from the camp with his wife and their 3 children, heading for a hunting lodge in the mountains near a town called Spittel am Pirn, the kind of remote alpine retreat wealthy Austrians used long before the war, and would keep using long after it. Picture that scene for a second, because it matters. A man responsible for tens of thousands of deaths, hiding out with his family in a cozy mountain lodge, while back at the camp he'd just abandoned, American soldiers were discovering exactly what he'd left behind. For nearly 3 weeks, he stayed hidden there, waiting, presumably, for the chaos of total collapse to settle into something he could quietly disappear inside of permanently, the same way thousands of other SS officers were hoping to vanish into false names and forged papers across the ruins of the Reich that spring. It almost worked. It didn't work because of who came looking for him. An American patrol, tracking him down in the final weeks of May, wasn't alone. Riding with the soldiers were former prisoners of Mauthausen, men who knew this camp, who knew this commandant's face, and who had waited a long time for exactly this moment. When the patrol found Zierreis, the official account says he was shot while attempting to escape. That phrase should sound familiar by now if you know anything about how these stories tend to end. It's the same explanation offered again and again across the collapse of the Third Reich. And it's the kind of sentence that can mean exactly what it says, or can mean something considerably less official happened in those woods, witnessed by men with every reason in the world not to let this particular prisoner simply walk into a courtroom months later. Whatever actually happened in those first minutes, Zierreis didn't die on the spot. He was alive, badly wounded, and he was taken to a hospital at Gusen, one of Mauthausen's own subcamps, now under American control. And this is where the story stops being about a manhunt and becomes something much stranger. For 6 to 8 hours through the night, as Zierreis lay dying from his wounds, he was interrogated. Not by a military prosecutor building a case file, not with a court stenographer taking down an official transcript. By Hans Marsalek, a former Mauthausen prisoner who had survived the camp, Zierreis ran, sitting in the room alongside Colonel Richard Seibel, the American officer whose 11th Armored Division now controlled the camp, a Polish survivor of the same camp, and a doctor who had also once been a prisoner there himself, forced for years to treat the very system now watching one of its architects bleed out in front of him. A dying man, surrounded almost entirely by the people he had spent years terrorizing, with one American colonel present in the room, apparently there to supervise whatever this was supposed to be, without ever fully explaining later exactly what role he thought he was playing. And Zierreis talked. According to Marsalek, he confessed freely because he knew by that point that he was not going to survive the night. What came out, according to the account later written down, was an unfiltered catalog of what had actually happened inside Mauthausen. The systematic killing of Jewish prisoners, executions carried out on Zierreis's own orders, the camp's use of a mobile gas van alongside its fixed gas chamber, the forced death marches that emptied satellite camps in the war's final weeks, a brothel operated inside the camp using female prisoners, the tattooing and marking system used to track inmates like inventory, and, among the darkest claims attributed to him, the use of human skin from murdered prisoners to bind books and make small leather goods for SS officers. That last claim in particular sits in a strange category of Holocaust-era testimony. Horrifying, attributed directly to a dying man in a documented interrogation, and also the kind of specific atrocity claim that historians have learned to handle with real caution because similar allegations at other camps were later found to be exaggerated, misattributed, or impossible to independently verify with physical evidence. "We're telling you what the confession says," he said. "We're not telling you every detail of it has been independently proven beyond dispute, because it hasn't, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty." Zierreis died on the evening of the 24th of May, 1945, roughly a day and a half after the interrogation ended. Marsalik's account was handed over to Colonel Seibel and would go on to be cited in the war crimes trials that followed, entered into the historical record as testimony from a man who no longer had any reason left to lie. Except here's the detail that most retellings of this story leave out entirely, and it's the one that should make you sit up. Colonel Seibel, the American officer who was physically in that room, who watched the entire interrogation happen, later refused to sign the written confession that Marsalik eventually produced. Not right away. 10 months later, from memory, Marsalik wrote out what he recalled Zierreis saying that night. And it's that document, not a signed contemporaneous transcript, that ended up circulating as the confession. Seibel wouldn't put his name to it. He also declined to testify about it at the Nuremberg tribunal. And there's a competing account from other sources present that night, claiming Zierreis actually never regained full consciousness after his wounds, and never gave any coherent statement to his captors at all. That the entire confession, as we know it, may be, at least in part, reconstructed testimony, rather than a verbatim record of a dying man's words. What actually happened in that hospital room stays genuinely uncertain. Maybe a commandant, staring at his own death, finally told the truth to the people he'd spent years destroying. Or maybe his own former prisoners, sitting inches from the man who ran their camp, wrote the ending they needed him to have said, with an American officer in the room choosing not to stop it, and later choosing not to endorse it either. We don't get to know for certain. And that uncertainty is not a flaw in this story. It might be the entire point of it. Almost every dramatic retelling of Zierreis' death skips straight past this part, presenting the confession as settled fact, a villain's tidy final monologue before the curtain falls. The real record is messier than that, and messier, in this case, is also more honest. Consider how strange this scene actually is if you step back from it. In any functioning legal system, everything about that room would disqualify whatever came out of it. The interrogators weren't neutral. They were direct victims of the man they were questioning, with every reason on earth to want him to say exactly what he said. The subject was dying, in pain, almost certainly not in a state to carefully weigh his words the way a defendant preparing testimony normally would. There was no defense counsel, no judge, no rules of evidence, nothing resembling due process in any sense a courtroom would recognize. And the one person in the room with genuine institutional authority, the one man wearing an American uniform, chose afterward not to attach his name to what came out of it. That's not a small detail. That's the entire case for reasonable doubt, delivered by the single most credible witness available. What we do know, without any dispute, is how Zierreis ended up in that room in the first place. An American patrol found him. American soldiers had every legal authority in that moment to take him into custody, process him, and hand him over to face trial through the same legal machinery that would soon convict dozens of his fellow camp officials at Nuremberg and in the later Mauthausen trials. Instead, whether by accident of a bullet meant to stop an escape, or by something closer to a decision quietly made and never fully explained, Zierreis ended up dying slowly, in a bed, surrounded by his own victims, with an American colonel standing by and watching it happen without intervening, and later, without putting his signature on the record of what was said. That is not the clean, procedural ending of a war crimes trial. It's something messier, and in its own way, something almost more honest about what liberation actually looked like on the ground, away from the courtrooms and the official photographs. There is a version of this story where the American soldiers are simply the heroes who finally ran a monster to ground after 3 weeks of hiding, delivered him to the people who had earned the right to see him face consequences, and let history sort out the rest. There's real truth in that version, and it shouldn't get buried underneath everything that came after. Nobody forced Zierreis into hiding in a mountain lodge with his family instead of surrendering openly and facing whatever came next. Nobody made him run the camp the way he ran it for 6 years. Before that, personally, on the ground, not from behind a desk somewhere safely removed from the killing. The Americans who tracked him down through 3 weeks of alpine terrain, with limited intelligence and no guarantee he was even still in the area, did something that genuinely mattered. They found a man who had spent years believing he might simply disappear into the post-war chaos the way so many others managed to, changing his name, crossing a border, starting over under someone else's identity. They made sure he didn't get that chance. That's not nothing. That's the kind of unglamorous, patient work that rarely makes it into the movie version of the war's ending. And it deserves to be said plainly before we go anywhere near the more uncomfortable part of this story. But there's also a harder version sitting right next to that one, and it's the version this channel exists to sit with instead of looking away from. A wounded, dying man, interrogated for hours through the night by the very people he had tormented, with the one neutral witness in the room later refusing to certify what was actually said. That is not a war crimes trial, and it clearly wasn't one. Call it justice finally arriving on its own terms, decades before anyone could argue about due process. Or call it a different kind of ending, written by people who had every human right to want one, whether or not it happened to be entirely true. So here's what I actually want to know from you in the comments. Because historians are still arguing about this, and I don't think there's an easy answer. When an American colonel sits in a room, watches a dying war criminal be interrogated by his own former prisoners instead of a legal process, and later refuses to sign what came out of it, is his silence protecting the truth by refusing to certify something he wasn't sure of? Or is it protecting everyone in that room by simply choosing not to look too closely at what had just happened in front of him? What happened to Zierreis's family is its own small, separate footnote worth sitting with for a moment. His wife and children, hiding with him in that lodge until the moment the patrol arrived, were not soldiers, were not SS, had committed no documented crime of their own beyond sharing a name and a roof with a man the world had every reason to want gone. War has a way of drawing lines that don't stay clean, catching people up in consequences that were never really theirs to answer for. And that particular thread of the story rarely gets told at all, buried underneath the far more dramatic scene in the hospital room. If stories like this are the kind of history you want more of, the uncomfortable kind that doesn't hand you a clean verdict and doesn't let either side off the hook completely, subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly the territory we keep coming back to. And if this one got under your skin, if you found yourself rooting for the room full of former prisoners one moment and uneasy about what that room actually was the next, hit like before you go. It helps this reach more people who think they already know exactly how these stories end, when most of the time they really don't. We'll be back soon with the next one.